This is Reimagining Higher Education, your go-to podcast with remarkable education leaders sharing personal stories from their experience in and around the sector, including reflection and evidence for progress in the sector. With your host, Studiosity's founder and president of Friends of Libraries Australia, Jack Goodman.
Well, welcome, Hilary. It is lovely to see you, and you're looking very well, I might add. So thank you for taking the time to do this today.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, we usually start these interviews off by asking the interviewee to share an object or something in their life that's had some significance or importance to them that might be a starting point for a conversation about themselves and then about their educational journey. So have you brought something along?
I have. I didn't expect it to be the start, but here we go. And you can see it, I think. Let me...
The Fatal Shore. Oh, it's a fabulous book. Yeah, Robert Hughes. Absolutely. And you've got the hardback, I can see.
I've got the hardback, but
oh, is it inscribed?
Yes.
Can you read that to us?
Yes. It says, "With many thanks for all you've done for geography at Plymouth and every best wish for the future." And it's signed by basically the whole geography department in Plymouth. In 1987, when I moved to Australia, and they chose to give me The Fatal Shore.
Had you ever read the book before then?
No, I hadn't.
And what did you think?
I loved it.
Yeah, it's an amazing book, and it's a classic, isn't it?
It is. I mean, they gave me other things too. They all tried to draw a map of Australia, which was quite interesting, and they put it in a card and framed it for me.
These are geography experts.
These are geography experts, yes, that's
and
right.
How did they do?
Well, there was a distinct generational difference. So the older staff members were pretty good at drawing the map of Australia, and the younger ones weren't.
Isn't that interesting? Geography wasn't being taught the same way, obviously.
No, that's right. Geography changed quite a lot from expecting people to know the capitals of all the countries and which one was the longest river and what was the name of the sea that separated X from Y.
Right.
So, yes, it was quite stark. I couldn't find that particular item, or else I'd have brought it with me instead of Fatal Shore.
So that's a really interesting item to have brought along, and I think it does draw us into this. The first thing I'm a little bit curious about, knowing a little bit about your background, but maybe you could share a little bit about, obviously, I guess, growing up in the UK and being educated in the UK, and then making this big shift, which has apparently been a lifetime shift since you've been here for, I guess, since 1987. Then is that
35
right?
years.
Wow. Can you tell us, a little bit about your education growing up and where in the UK and what that was like?
Yeah, that was interesting. I was talking to our research group yesterday, and I started off by saying I was a precocious brat.
A brat.
Which is probably true. And I think if you ask my elder siblings, they would say the same. So I was reading at 3, did my 11 plus at 9, that type of thing. But in England, so we were in East Anglia when I was a child, up to about the age of 9, and then moved to the Midlands, and so that was quite traumatic for me at 9, because I was very ensconced in my little circle, and then moving what seemed to be a long way, which of course is no distance at all by Australian standards.
Yeah, it's next door.
It was traumatic for me, but I went to Oxford as an undergraduate and as a postgrad, and I really just followed the drive for learning about geography, which I think came in almost my first geography lesson in high school.
What was the appeal of geography in high school?
Well, I was just from the very first lesson, I was fascinated because we were learning about the southeast of England, another place not very far away.
Yep.
The landscape was different. The houses, the crops. We had pictures of oast houses where people, dealt with the hops that were used for brewing. I just thought it's the difference between these places that were so far apart just grabbed me.
So
and it still does.
And it still does. So some combination of the history component of geography and the human element and trying to imagine what the world was like that long ago. And that's really interesting. Do you remember that teacher that sparked that interest? Yes,
her name was Miss Breen, but I don't know what her first name was because you didn't in those days. And
so you ended up at Oxford for both your undergraduate and postgraduate years. So you spent a lot of time there. Then what was that like? How would you describe Oxford? I guess that was when
Oxford in the
late 70s or early 80s.
70s. We're talking a long time ago, and we're talking of a time when a very small percentage of people went to university.
Right.
And an even smaller percentage obviously went to Oxford and Cambridge. And then when you took the women, that was about 10% of my geography cohort.
Right. Wow.
So it was a special, a really special thing to do. And I went there, I was 17 by the time I went there. And I suppose I've got rose-coloured spectacles, but it was, a time that was really quite blissful. I had a government grant, which wasn't wealth untold, but it covered all the
all your costs. Yeah.
It was the full on-campus experience.
You were in one of the colleges.
Yes.
Like everybody.
You
lived in the college.
I lived in college.
Ate all the food with all the other students in college hall.
Yeah, the food wasn't always great, but it was there.
It was England in the 1970s, and it was college food, I suppose.
Yeah, that's right. But I think it was really easy compared to how undergraduates have to work now. So in even my first 2 years of postgraduate work, when I stayed in Oxford, I stayed on to do a DPhil, they call it there.
Yes.
And I was there for 2 years. So you've got a community all around you, you've got a social life, you've got no pressures to work, you're not juggling family things. But after the first 2 years, when I actually wasn't in Oxford, it became much harder, I think, because you haven't got all those supports around you. I hadn't got the lower research room, which is where I sat. You hadn't got those people to help you.
Were you out in the field, or where were you for the third year?
No, I wasn't in the field then. No, I'd moved down to Sussex, so down to the southeast.
Okay.
I did do some field work in France, but that was only really a couple of months, just collecting some census data. So I think, my undergraduate time was really lovely. I played hockey. I went to punting. The social life was great. Learned to drink. My supervisor to drink. That sounds terrible, but I drank things like Pimm's for the first time, and my
supervisor. That's a thing. Garden parties with Pimm's, right?
Yeah, that's right.
That's not a gin and tonic you've got there, though, right?
No, it's water.
Yeah, me too. Cheers. But that's a really interesting experience, and it seems like a long way from the experiences you must have had when you left Plymouth and then decided to come to Australia and the places you've worked at here. What was it, just sort of skipping ahead, what brought you to Australia? Can you share that with us?
Oh, jobs. And I came with my then husband. He got a job at the University of New England.
Yeah.
And he said, do you want to go to Australia? Do you want to get married? And I said, yes. And then, which took about a couple of seconds, and then it took months to actually sort things out, and,
right,
sell houses and get visas and have medicals and do all those things. So
wow.
I actually gave up my job, which was whatever a 10-year job was in Plymouth at those days, on the assumption that Australia was not going to be a fatal shore, but would be a shore of opportunity. And indeed,
how did you, the book, what did you think of the significance of the book when you started to read it, I suppose, and the message that your peers were sending you by giving you that particular book about Australian history?
I thought it was just, it was done in good part, it was good humour. I didn't think they were, some of them came out to visit and do sabbaticals.
Yeah. So, was it a culture shock, or how would you describe the transition to Australia? And you've worked now at many Australian universities, but they've been for the most part in regional Australia and South Australia as well. But would that be accurate?
Yes. Yeah. So none in metropolitan areas.
Yeah.
I did have an opportunity to work in Sydney at one point and decided I didn't want to.
Yeah.
But
you preferred the regions. What is it about the regions or regional education? And just for our listeners or viewers, you've been at Central Queensland, CQ University, I think, and you were at UNE, I guess, for a while when you first came.
I just had a fellowship there. I was only there for 6 months, and then I got a job at Wollongong.
Right.
And my first contract there was for 3 weeks.
Wow, that's a short one.
What can you do?
What can you do in 3 weeks?
I don't know. I think I must have been filling in for somebody. I can't remember the details of that. And then it was 1 semester, and then it was the real thing.
Right.
But you were asking, was it a culture shock? And I think no, not really. Partly because I am a geographer, and partly because I read a lot, and I think I knew what to expect. I pretty much knew what to expect, although I had just watched Crocodile Dundee. And
what did that make you think?
That got me more worried than the fatal shore, to be honest.
Fair enough.
But I found that universities were actually really very, on the whole, very nice places to work. That you didn't get the sort of rampant misogyny that you do get in that you did at the time get in other workplaces. Although I'm not saying it's been ideal for women, but they were better workplaces than many others, as far as I could see. And what I did like was that there was much less class distinction than you get in the UK, and that you still get in the UK. And I do remember somebody, an eminent-ish visitor who'd come out to Australia from England, and I found had been at Oxford about the same time as me. And she was quite chatty, and she said, "And which school did you go to?" And when I said I went to convent grammar school in the middle of Wolverhampton that was now demolished for an urban motorway, she wasn't interested anymore.
Yeah,
it still mattered, despite all the things I'd done in between, it still mattered to her that I hadn't gone to a posh school.
Right. So you've got the sense that Australia doesn't have the sort of class-based system in the same way that the UK
Not
does.
in the same way. It's not as I mean, it is there. Of course, it's there.
Yeah.
But it's not as overt. It's not as in your face. It's not like people's first question isn't about which school you went to.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's the second or third.
Usually they don't care. I hear
you.
It's more
Absolutely.
about, it's more of a meritocracy.
Yeah.
I think, and I like that.
But you spent, of all the universities you've worked at, where have you spent the most time?
Newcastle. I was 10 years at Newcastle.
Yeah, okay.
Through the 90s, last century.
Yeah, last century.
But 1991 to 2001.
And I guess Newcastle, and then also CQ. Were you in Rockhampton for that stretch of time, or is that where you're based?
I did go to Rockhampton. Yes.
Yeah.
And I went to Adelaide from Newcastle.
Yeah. Was that UniSA or was that
UniSA? Well, I was at Flinders for a couple of years.
And Flinders as well.
Got coached by Denise Bradley.
All right. Oh, that's a name from the past. Lovely. Yeah, she was fantastic, wasn't she?
She was an amazing leader.
Yeah, exactly. How have you seen the sector here change? You've seen it. You've really had an interesting sort of observer's eye, and you've moved around, and you've really probably been one of the more had more of a varied observer's perspective and participants' perspective from the late 80s to now. What would you say have been the big transformational moments for the higher ed here?
In 80, I think it was 88, that the sector was just going through the Dawkins reforms.
Right.
And so that was a start. I think that was the start away from the small elite system that I was describing in England, to a much more massified, a much more equitable system. And it was the time when the CAEs, the Institutes of Technology, came into the university sector.
Right, they merged in. Right.
Yeah,
and we started this process of growing to much larger institutions.
Yes, that's right. And so there were amalgamations, and some worked better than others, and some, some didn't work at all. But most did. I mean, UniSA, I think, was an amalgamation of about 5 different institutions, Institutes of Technology and the CAEs. And one of the things that did was to bring far more women into the sector, because most of the education and nursing students were female, and still are. And so you had a shift, not only in terms of size, but this massive shift in terms of discipline and gender. But at that time, you still had mainly men in the senior positions, in the professorial positions, and mainly young women as students. Was not particularly healthy type of balance. So that was a really big one, and I'm sure I didn't really understand what was going on at the time.
Right.
But looking back, I think that was a big shift.
Yeah, that would be a huge shift. And obviously what we've been sort of living the Dawkins reforms ever since. Universities have gotten bigger and bigger. And then Denise Bradley's widening participation agenda, maybe that's another big milestone there. And so we've seen a huge increase in domestic students in the last 10 years, certainly.
Yes, that's right. And big efforts to try and bring in disadvantaged groups. And I think that's one of the things that drives me. I see education as being not quite a silver bullet, but almost the closest thing we've got to it, to combat disadvantage. And that's one of the things I like about regional universities, that they're such powerhouses to provide professionals for the local workforce.
Right.
They bring people in, I think in a way this goes back to the Dawkins reforms. They provide those pathways for people. Newcastle had an enabling program, and at some point I chaired the board for that. Had an enabling program with 1,500 students in it when I was there. So these were people who for some reason, hadn't got a year 12 qualification, who'd been disadvantaged in some way, who were Indigenous, had disabilities, whatever, or just had an interrupted education. That was fantastic. I had a student who started in the enabling program, went through the geography, I think it's Bachelor of Arts she did with the geography major, went on, did a PhD with me, and it transformed her life. And it transformed her life in some predictable ways too, because she grew completely apart from the man she'd married, because she was no longer the woman that he'd married.
Right. Well, it's an interesting, it's a really interesting point, and there's no doubt that regional universities have a particularly powerful role to play because they tend to be the only game in town, and there aren't lots of choices. And we know there is a significant gap in educational achievement between the regions and metropolitan Australia. It's something like 25 or 30%. It's just really, really substantial and persistent. Yeah. So I was going to say, if there was something you could change for students right now, and I guess maybe mostly for regional, thinking in the context of regional Australia, that's really where your expertise is and experience. What would it be that you would change?
The funding, especially students who want to do things that the previous government didn't perceive as being particularly valuable. The fees, the debts that they're racking up, and I'd like them not to have to juggle, small kids and aging parents and work and study. At CDU, only 4% of our students are school leavers.
4%. Yeah. Yep.
The
exact opposite of Oxford. I would guess that there are almost no percent that aren't school leavers at Oxford.
No, I think there was one in my cohort of about 90.
Okay, almost none. Yeah, right. So I realize, I guess it's the luxury experience that we've had, right? That those of us who had that school leaving on campus,
I think
condensed years with no responsibilities other than learning.
I think that's the main thing that I would like to change, but I don't think that's realistic, because you can't go back to where we were, and it was only a very tiny proportion of people that had the benefit of that experience.
And the city of Darwin is not Oxford, England, and it never will be, or the Northern Territory could not be sort of further.
Certainly not. You don't get that much variation in landscape, in 100 kilometers.
That's right.
Which you do in England.
So it's a very different kind of an institution and a purpose, really, right?
Yeah. But the nice thing is that students do enjoy it. They love their teaching staff, whether it's face to face. For some people, it's never face to face. If you live in Yundabu or Nhulunbuy or Echo Island,
right,
it's never face to face.
It's never going to be face to face.
No, it can't be.
Well, speaking of all of that and what that student experience is like, since it happens to be in the news this week, maybe we just talk briefly about the quilt data that just came out and has just been reported on. And I'm just sort of wondering if that gives you any sort of insights or thoughts about the student experience, thinking about CDU and things that are going well, or things that you might like to see changed for these students who have got so many competing priorities and so many challenges that they face.
Well, then I think the good thing is that CDU's results are really, really quite good. And we also use the Net Promoter Score, which is a very simple measure. You know, would you recommend to your family or friends? And yes, they would. So those two things are good. And when we dig down and see, well, what is it that you like? And it is mostly the teaching staff, and it's it's the quality of the teaching staff, the passion of the teaching staff that seems to shape their experience most up here. And that's partly because, you know, they haven't got a hockey team to join, because they're doing all these other things, and they, you know, they haven't got the same sort of social life, because their social life revolves around, you know, the people they know from picking up their own kids from school or whatever it is. It is different. The nice thing about here is that we can, because we're small, we can do things differently. You know, we've got some lovely pathway programs.
And it's a dual sector institute too, right? I mean,
it's dual sector, and so you can make a difference to a lot of people's lives, and a lot of people don't want and don't need the 3-year degree.
Something shorter or more achievable.
And that gives them a set of competencies, a set of skills, a ticket that they can use.
So you're thinking that this whole current wave of sort of micro-credentials and stackable qualifications is something that's got particular appeal in the territory?
Well, you can certainly do it in the vocational sector very easily, because again, people are often not looking for a full, you know, advanced diploma. They're looking for more bite-sized pieces that will actually enable them to work. And there's such a demand for labour up there. Such a demand. And that is obviously affecting all universities at the moment, because when unemployment is low, then people are going into work rather than
people are more inclined to take a job and
building their qualifications.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think part of the reason also that CDU seems to have this strong relationship with students is that it's you know, it's probably got a slightly different, or maybe quite a very different balance between its research and teaching agendas compared to maybe some of the bigger urban universities, more focused on the students and the teaching and learning?
Well,
or is that totally wrong?
I wouldn't underestimate the research at CDU. CDU with Menzies School of Health Research, was the two are combined. I mean, you know, 65 million odd in research funding would be considerably more than any of the Run group at the moment. And it's in about the middle of the pack for the IRU. So the research is significant, but I do feel that we concentrate on really good research elements for the territory. So, you know, what the Molly Centre does in terms of birthing on country for First Nations people, the work that's being done on drones, which is an amazing tool for a territory that's, you know, 6 times the size of Britain, with a population of less than 1 million. So some of the environmental work, you know, crocodile.
There's a lot of them. They've really made a comeback, haven't they?
Well, yes, now they're no longer hunted. So I think, don't underestimate the research that's done up here. It's pretty sensational for the size of the university.
Does it inform the teaching and learning experience for the students, or do you feel like they're relatively separate?
It does in some areas. As I said, you know, the environmental stuff, the engineering, defence, First Nations. The First Nations work done through the Northern Institute is phenomenal. So yeah, it does in some places,
Some areas,
but not in others. And I think you will find that almost everywhere. I don't think that research in business areas tends to inform mass business teaching.
Yeah. Look, before I let you go, we're nearly at the end of time here, but before I let you go, I thought I'd ask you sort of a final two-part question. You've had an amazing career. It's still going. It's remarkable, and you've done some incredible things. And I just think that where you've traveled and what you've achieved is something that is obviously to be celebrated. And congratulations on your AM. I guess that was just this year. That was exciting. So obviously, I'm not the only one to think that you've achieved a lot. But if you were able to go back in time and give your younger self a piece of advice, what would that be? And then if you were thinking about providing any similar advice to aspiring leaders in Australian universities, what would that look like?
Good question. Well, I think for me, following the geography that I felt passionate about, is a really good piece of advice, to follow your passion, because unless you really enthusiastic or knowledgeable about what you're teaching, what you're researching, it comes across, if you're just doing it. And the people who sort of do accounting or hotel management or something because their families want them to go into the family business, it doesn't really cut it. I know a couple of lads down who were UniSA graduates in architecture, and a great disappointment to their parents because they decided to set up a gin distillery. And they're doing extraordinarily well, and it's great.
I have no doubt. That's a growing sector.
Yeah, that's right. But also, it's something about being authentic. Know who you are, know what your identity is, and be true to that, and don't be sort of artificial.
That's a hard thing. That's hard. It's easier said than done in the academy, isn't it? I mean,
it is, but in your own workplace, with your own team, with the university, possibly not so much on a public stage. But if you're going to be a leader, you've got to have that, both the passion and the authenticity, I think.
Okay.
But also, I mean, a great belief that education makes the world a better place, and that's what we're here for. We're here for the students. We're here to make the world a better place. Pay it forward.
Well, and on that note, I would like to just thank you very much for your time. I think we can all agree that is absolutely what we're here to do, which is to pay it forward. And that's a lovely expression. And thank you so much for your time today, Hilary. It's been lovely catching up. And I really wish you the best of luck at CDU. And I'm sure you're going to help continue on its journey.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Jack.
Visit studiosity.com/studentsfirst for the next Students First Symposium, an open forum for faculty, staff and academics to candidly discuss and progress the issues that matter most in higher education. studiosity.com/studentsfirst